There are moments in the grand sweep of history that are so profound, so deeply and collectively traumatic, that they cleave time itself in two. There is the world that existed before, and the fundamentally altered world that came after. For an entire generation of Americans, and for the nation they defined and the world they led, that moment occurred with the shocking finality of a rifle shot at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, November 22, 1963. It happened on a sun-drenched street in the heart of a bustling American city. It was the moment when a dream of a brighter, more vigorous, more hopeful futuria fleeting, optimistic and glamorous era that had come to be known as Camelot was shattered with brutal and public finality. That moment, of course, was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. It was an act of political violence so shocking, so brazenly public, and so viscerally brutal that it became seared into the collective consciousness of the world. Everyone who was alive at that time, and old enough to comprehend, remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. It was a national trauma on an unprecedented scale, a wound that, for many, has never truly healed, its scar tissue still sensitive to the touch, even after more than half a century. In the chaotic hours and days that followed that terrible event, a narrative began to form, one that was solidified with breathtaking and, for many, suspicious speed. A suspect, a lone marginalized figure, was arrested within hours. A strange, volatile, and deeply enigmatic 24-year-old ex-Marine and self-proclaimed Marxist named Lee Harvey Oswald. Within 48 hours before he could ever stand trial and tell his side of the story, Oswald himself was murdered on live national television by a Dallas nightclub owner with mob connections named Jack Ruby. And in the weeks that followed, a special presidential commission was formed by the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. It was headed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, and it was tasked with a monumental mission: to investigate the crime of the century and to report its findings to a grieving and bewildered American people, to put their fears to rest. 10 months later, in September of 1964, the Warren Commission released its final, 888-page report, along with 26 volumes of supporting evidence and testimony. Its conclusion was stark, unambiguous, and intended to be the final authoritative word on the matter. It stated that President John F. Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding in the car with him, were struck by bullets fired from a single rifle, in the hands of a single man, firing from a single location. It concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, acting entirely on his own, for motives that were never fully explained. It concluded that Jack Ruby, too, had acted alone, motivated by a fit of patriotic grief. And most importantly, it concluded that there was no conspiracy, domestic or foreign, behind the assassination. The case, as far as the United States government was concerned, was officially and definitively closed. But the American people did not agree. From the very beginning, the official story felt wrong. It felt too simple, too neat, too convenient. It failed to account for the deep sense of unease, the nagging unanswered questions, and the seemingly endless list of bizarre inconsistencies, strange coincidences, and suspicious deaths that surrounded the event. For nearly 60 years, a consistent and overwhelming majority of Americans have told pollsters that they do not believe the findings of the Warren Commission. They believe that their president was taken from them by a conspiracy. Tonight, we will not simply retell the story of that tragic day in Dallas. We will open the case file. We will become forensic investigators. We will delve into the strange, unsettling, and often contradictory details that have fueled 6 decades of doubt and debate. This will be an investigation in 2 parts. In the first and most crucial part of our investigation, we will examine the what of the crime. We will put the official story itself on trial. We will focus not on speculation but on the hard evidence, the physical, the medical, and the ballistic. We will meticulously deconstruct the single, controversial, and absolutely essential linchpin upon which the entire lone gunman theory rests. the incredible, logic-defying, and seemingly impossible journey of a single bullet, a small copper-jacketed projectile that has come to be known by its critics as the magic bullet theory. Then in the second part, if we find that the official story cannot withstand critical scrutiny, we will be forced to ask the most dangerous and consequential question of all. Who? We will explore the rogues gallery of potential conspirators, the powerful groups and shadowy organizations that had both the motive and the means to carry out a presidential assassination. We will journey into the dark heart of a potential deep state conspiracy, exploring the plausible and often overlapping connections to the mafia, to fiercely anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and even to the United States' own intelligence agencies, including the CIA. This is a story of a national tragedy, a deeply flawed investigation, and a mystery that continues to haunt the American soul. This is the enduring, agonizing enigma of the JFK assassination. Part 1. The Impossible Journey of Commission Exhibit 399 Anatomy of the Magic Bullet Theory. To understand the core of the controversy, the very foundation of 6 decades of doubt, we must first transport ourselves to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, at precisely 12:30 p.m. on November 22, 1963. The presidential motorcade is making its slow, triumphant procession through the city. The presidential limousine, a specially modified 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, codenamed SS-100X by the Secret Service, is making its slow, final 120-degree turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street. The crowds are cheering, waving small American flags. The Texas sun is shining. In the limousine's plush rear seat on the right side sits President John F. Kennedy, smiling and waving to the crowd. Beside him, to his left, is the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, radiant in her now iconic pink Chanel suit and pillbox hat. Seated directly in front of them in a folding jump seat is the popular governor of Texas, John B. Connally Jr. on the right and his wife Nellie on the left. This precise seating arrangement, the relative positions of the two men, is absolutely critical to understanding the ballistic puzzle that is about to unfold. As the limousine passes a large green Stemmons freeway sign, the first shot rings out. The moment, in all its brutal reality, is captured forever in a silent, grainy, and horrifyingly vivid 8mm home movie being filmed by a local Dallas dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder. The Zapruder film, all 26.6 seconds and 486 frames of it, is the single most important piece of evidence in the assassination. It is our clock, our timeline, our brutal, unblinking, and objective witness to the horror. The Warren Commission concluded, based on witness testimony and the discovery of a rifle and spent shell casings, that 3 shots were fired from a 6th-floor window in the southeastern corner of the Texas Schoolbook Depository Building, a large brick warehouse located behind and to the right of the presidential limousine. The rifle found at the scene was a cheap, Italian-made 6.5mm Mannlicher Carcano bolt-action rifle, a weapon that had been purchased by Lee Harvey Oswald through a mail-order advertisement in a magazine. The commission determined, through analysis of the evidence, that one of the 3 shots fired by Oswald missed the limousine entirely, striking a curb and slightly injuring a bystander named James Tague. The last of the 3 shots, frame 313 of the Zapruder film, was the fatal one, striking the president in the back of the head with catastrophic force. This leaves the first successful shot, the shot that initiated the terrible sequence of events. And it is this shot that is the source of all the problems, the seed of all the doubt. In the Zapruder film, at approximately frame 224, we see President Kennedy suddenly stop waving. His hands fly up to his throat, his elbows jut out, his face contorts in pain. He has clearly been hit. A mere 1.6 seconds later, at approximately frame 254, we see Governor Connally, seated in front of him, react violently. His body stiffens and lurches to the right, his cheeks puff out as air is forced from his lungs, his mouth opens as if to scream, and he begins to slump down into his wife's lap. He too has clearly been hit. The problem for the Warren Commission was a simple, but intractable matter of time and motion. The FBI conducted extensive tests with Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle. They found that, due to the slow and somewhat clunky bolt-action mechanism, it was physically impossible for even a master marksman to fire the weapon twice in the 1.6 seconds that separated Kennedy's and Connolly's reactions. The absolute minimum time between two aimed shots was 2.3 seconds. This presented the commission's investigators, particularly a young and ambitious staff lawyer named Arlen Specter, who would later go on to a long and distinguished career as a U.S. Senator, with a massive, undeniable, and conclusion-threatening problem. If Oswald was the lone gunman, and he could not have fired two separate shots that quickly, then the only possible conclusion was that both men had to have been hit by the same bullet. This logical necessity, born from the immutable constraints of the Zapruder film's timeline, gave birth to the single most controversial, debated, and ridiculed conclusion in the entire Warren report. It gave birth to what Arlen Specter himself named the single bullet theory, or as its legions of critics have derisively nicknamed it, the magic bullet theory. This theory posits that a single bullet, fired from Oswald's rifle, caused a total of 7 separate wounds in 2 grown men. This bullet, later designated as Commission Exhibit 399 or C-399, was a 6.5 mm full metal jacket, copper-encased bullet that was found, almost by accident, on a stretcher at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where both the wounded president and the critically injured governor were taken. The Commission's official explanation is that this bullet, having completed its incredible journey, fell out of Governor Connolly's shallow thigh wound while he was being moved on the stretcher. Let us, with as much objectivity as we can muster, trace the incredible, almost unbelievable proposed journey of this single history-making projectile. According to the Warren Commission's final report, first, the bullet, fired from the 6th-floor window of the book depository, struck President Kennedy in the upper right side of his back, near the base of his neck. Second, it traveled on a downward trajectory through his body at an angle of approximately 17 degrees. It passed through the soft tissue of his neck, nicking his spine without shattering it and bruising his right lung. Third, the bullet then exited the front of his throat, just below his Adam's apple, creating a small, neat exit wound, a wound that was unfortunately obliterated by the emergency tracheotomy performed at Parkland Hospital. Fourth, after exiting the president's throat, the bullet, still traveling at a high velocity, continued its journey, traveling across the interior of the limousine for approximately 2 feet. Fifth, it then entered Governor Connolly's body, striking him in the back, just below his right armpit. Sixth, upon entering the governor, the bullet, a military-style round designed to pass through a target, instead tumbled, turning sideways. It then smashed through and shattered his 5th rib, sending fragments of bone flying through his chest cavity and collapsing his right lung. Seventh, the bullet then exited the front of Connolly's chest, just below his right nipple, leaving a large, gaping 5-centimeter exit wound. Eighth, after exiting Connolly's chest, the bullet, now tumbling end over end, continued on its path and passed through the governor's right wrist, which was resting in his lap. It struck his radius bone, one of the hardest bones in the human body, shattering it into multiple pieces. Ninth, it then exited his wrist on the palm side. 10th, the bullet's journey was still not over. It then entered his left thigh, embedding itself several inches deep into his powerful quadriceps muscle. And finally, at some point later at Parkland Hospital, this same bullet, after inflicting all 7 of these devastating wounds, shattering 2 hard bones, and presumably deforming and losing a significant amount of its mass, is said to have spontaneously and cleanly dislodged itself from the governor's thigh muscle and fallen onto his stretcher, in almost pristine, near-perfect condition. When you examine Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet itself, the absurdity of this official theory becomes starkly visually apparent. The bullet is a smooth, copper-jacketed projectile. It is slightly flattened at the base, but it is not significantly deformed, mushroomed, or fragmented. Forensic analysis showed that it had lost only a tiny fraction of its original mass, about 1.5%. The Warren Commission's own tests, in which they fired identical bullets through a human wrist bone from a cadaver, showed that the bullets were consistently and dramatically deformed, flattened into unrecognizable lead and copper slugs. Yet C-399, which supposedly shattered Connolly's dense radius bone, looks almost as if it could be loaded into a rifle and fired again. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a renowned forensic pathologist and one of the most vocal and persistent critics of the Commission's findings, has famously and repeatedly stated that the pristine condition of the bullet defies the laws of physics. It is a matter of utter, total, complete, and absolute nonsense. But the problems with the magic bullet theory go far beyond the miraculous condition of the bullet itself. The proposed trajectory of the bullet is just as problematic, if not more so. For this single bullet to have hit both men as described, Governor Connolly would have had to have been seated not directly in front of President Kennedy, but significantly to his left and significantly lower than the president. This is because the bullet hole in Kennedy's back was lower than the exit wound in his throat, indicating an upward path if the bullet continued in a straight line. Yet the wound in Connolly's back was lower than the wound in Kennedy's throat. The Commission tried to explain this apparent geometric impossibility by creating complex diagrams showing that, because of the downward slope of Elm Street and the slight rotation of the two men in their seats, the trajectory was just barely possible. However, critics argue that the Zapruder film simply does not support this necessary seating arrangement. In the frames just before the shot, Connolly appears to be seated almost directly in front of Kennedy, and at a similar, if not slightly higher, height. For the bullet to have followed its proposed path, it would have had to make a sharp zigzag turn in midair between the two men, a physical impossibility. This is what led to the theory's derisive nickname. It wasn't just a bullet. It was a magic bullet, capable of changing direction and passing through hard human bone without leaving a scratch. Furthermore, there is the powerful and consistent testimony of Governor John Connolly himself. Until the day he died in 1993, Governor Connolly was adamant that he was not hit by the same bullet that hit President Kennedy. He stated clearly and repeatedly, in his testimony to the Warren Commission and in countless interviews, "I heard the first shot. I turned to my right and I could not see the president. I was in the process of turning back to my left when I was hit. I have always contended that I was hit by the second shot." If Governor Connolly's own vivid recollection is correct, then there were two separate shots which, given the 1.6-second time frame established by the Zapruder film, means there had to have been a second gunman. The medical evidence, too, is a source of endless controversy and debate. The initial autopsy of the president, conducted under chaotic, high-pressure, and highly unusual conditions at Bethesda Naval Hospital, was deeply and demonstrably flawed. The military doctors who performed it were not experienced forensic pathologists and were unaccustomed to examining gunshot wounds. They initially failed to even discover the exit wound in the president's throat, because doctors at Parkland Hospital had performed an emergency tracheotomy through that very wound in a desperate attempt to help him breathe. The diagrams and measurements taken during the autopsy have been criticized by subsequent review panels as inaccurate, and have been revised multiple times. The autopsy notes themselves were burned by one of the doctors involved, a highly irregular act. The magic bullet theory is the absolute linchpin of the entire lone gunman theory. It is not a minor detail. It is the central pillar holding up the entire official story. If the single bullet theory is false, if it is physically, ballistically, and medically impossible, then the central conclusion of the Warren Commission collapses into a heap of rubble. If JFK and Connolly were hit by separate bullets, then there had to have been more than one shooter, or at least shots fired too quickly for a single bolt-action rifle. And if there was more than one shooter, then there was, by definition, a conspiracy. The profound absurdity of this single miraculous bullet is the doorway through which all the other theories of the JFK assassination enter. It is the piece of the puzzle that simply does not fit, compelling us to move beyond the officially sanctioned, what, and begin to ask the far more dangerous and consequential question of who. Part 2. The Rogues Gallery exploring the labyrinth of conspiracy. If we accept, for the sake of investigation, that the magic bullet theory is untenable and that the assassination was, therefore, the result of a conspiracy, we are then faced with a bewildering, almost dizzying array of potential culprits. The list of groups and individuals who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to kill John F. Kennedy is long, complex, and deeply unsettling. We will now explore the most credible, persistent, and well-researched of these theories, stepping into the murky, smoke-filled world of a potential deep state conspiracy. Suspect 1: the Mafia La Cosa Nostra. A dish best served cold. Of all the potential conspirators, organized crime had perhaps the most straightforward, visceral, and compelling motive for wanting President Kennedy dead. That motive can be summed up in 2 words: Robert Kennedy. As Attorney General, JFK's younger brother, the intense and puritanical Bobby Kennedy, waged a relentless, obsessive, and unprecedented war on the American Mafia. Bobby Kennedy was a crusading moralist who saw the mob as a cancer on American society, and he used the full power of the federal government to try and eradicate it. He increased the number of organized crime convictions by over 800%. He went after the very top of the mafia hierarchy, the powerful bosses of the National Commission, men who had previously been considered untouchable. 2 of the most powerful mob bosses in the country, Santo Trafficante Jr., the head of the Florida and Cuban rackets, and Carlos Marcello, the diminutive but utterly ruthless boss of New Orleans and the entire Gulf Coast, were under intense personal pressure from the Justice Department. Both were facing deportation, and both, according to later testimony from highly placed government informants and mob insiders, had openly and repeatedly discussed the need to kill the president to get his crusading brother off their backs. The logic was simple and brutal. Get rid of Jack and Bobby loses his power. As Carlos Marcello reportedly told an informant, "If you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head." But the mafia's motive was not just about stopping the prosecutions. It was also about a deep and bitter sense of betrayal. In the razor-thin 1960 presidential election, it is widely believed and supported by significant evidence that Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's powerful and often ruthless father, had used his connections to enlist the help of the Chicago mob boss, Sam Giancana, to deliver the crucial state of Illinois for his son. The mob, through its control of the unions, had delivered. They felt they had a man in the White House who owed them, a man who would be friendly. Instead of gratitude, they got Bobby Kennedy's all-out war. They felt double-crossed. Furthermore, the mob had another massive grievance against the Kennedy brothers: Cuba. Under the corrupt dictator Fulgencio Batista, Havana had been a gangster's paradise, a city of lavish, mob-run casinos and hotels that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in untaxed profits. When Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries took over, they shut it all down, kicking the mob out and seizing their assets. The mafia was desperate to get Cuba back. They had enthusiastically cooperated with their old enemy, the CIA, in the myriad plots to assassinate Castro, hoping that a new friendly regime would let them back in. When JFK failed to provide the promised air support at the Bay of Pigs, dooming the invasion, the mob felt betrayed yet again. He had failed to deliver their prize. The means and opportunity for the mob to carry out such an act were certainly there. The mafia had a nationwide network of professional hitmen, men who could kill without leaving a trace. They had influence in local police departments and labor unions across the country. And crucially, they had a direct and undeniable connection to the events in Dallas. Jack Ruby, the man who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, was not just a small-time, patriotic nightclub owner. Declassified government documents and investigative reporting have shown that he had deep and long-standing ties to organized crime figures, including associates of both Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. Many researchers believe that Ruby's murder of Oswald was not an act of spontaneous patriotic rage, as he tearfully claimed, but a professional hit, ordered by the mob to silence the patsy before he could talk and reveal the identities of his handlers. Suspect 2. The anti-Castro Cuban exiles of Fury scorned. Closely intertwined with the mafia and often working in concert with them, were the fiercely anti-communist Cuban exiles based in communities in Miami and New Orleans. This was a community seething with a sense of rage, betrayal, and righteous fury directed squarely at President John F. Kennedy. These were the men who had been trained by the CIA for the Bay of Pigs invasion. They had been promised that they were the vanguard of a new free Cuba. They believed that President Kennedy and the United States would back them up with the full force of American military power. When Kennedy withheld the air support and their brothers-in-arms were killed or captured on the beaches of Cuba, their admiration for JFK turned into a venomous, all-consuming hatred. They saw him as a coward and a traitor who had sent them to their deaths. This hatred was compounded and solidified after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. As part of the secret deal to get Soviet missiles out of Cuba, Kennedy had publicly pledged that the United States would not invade the island. For the exiles, this was the ultimate betrayal. It meant that the U.S. government had officially and permanently abandoned their dream of ever liberating their homeland. They felt they had been used and then cast aside. These were not just angry political activists. Many of them were highly trained CIA-sponsored commandos, experts in explosives, sabotage, and assassination. They were operating in a shadowy world of covert operations, often working alongside both the CIA and the Mafia in their ongoing, unsanctioned plots against Castro. Some researchers have pointed to Oswald's strange and contradictory activities in New Orleans in the summer of 1963 as evidence of a link to this world. He publicly distributed pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee literature, even getting into a well-publicized street brawl with anti-Castro Cubans. But at the same time, he was seen in the company of fervent anti-Castro activists and figures connected to the intelligence community, like the enigmatic Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent and right-wing extremist. The theory is that he was being deliberately and expertly set up, his public profile being carefully crafted to make him look like a pro-Castro communist, the perfect scapegoat for an assassination that would be blamed on Cuba, thus forcing the new president, Lyndon Johnson, to launch the invasion of Cuba that Kennedy had promised to avoid. Suspect 3. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the U.S. military, the enemy within. This is perhaps the most explosive, the most disturbing, and the most frightening theory of all. The one that leads us directly into the dark and labyrinthine heart of a potential deep state conspiracy. It posits that the assassination was not carried out by criminals or foreign exiles, but by rogue elements within the United States' own national security establishment. The motive, once again, stems from the Bay of Pigs and its aftermath. After the fiasco, President Kennedy was furious with the CIA. He felt they had misled him, lied to him, and deliberately bounced him into a disastrous operation. He fired the legendary and powerful director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, as well as his top deputies, Richard Bissell and Charles Cabell. Kennedy famously told one of his aides that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. For the old guard of the CIA, the hardline Cold Warriors who had built the agency during the OSS days of World War II, this was a declaration of war. They saw Kennedy as a dangerous amateur, a threat to their power, their autonomy, and their aggressive, no-holds-barred approach to fighting the Cold War. Their animosity only grew over the next 2 years. They were furious about his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, believing his diplomatic solution was a weak appeasement of the Soviets that had left Castro in power. And they were deeply and professionally concerned by what they saw as his dangerous drift towards détente with the Soviet Union, as evidenced by his signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and his rumored plans to withdraw all American military advisors from Vietnam after the 1964 election. For these men, Kennedy was not just a political opponent. He was a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. The means and opportunity for the CIA to carry out such an act were, of course, unparalleled. The CIA is the world's premier assassination and covert operations agency. They had the skills, the assets, and the technical expertise to stage a complex assassination with multiple shooters and then, crucially, to manage the cover-up, manipulate the evidence, and control the official investigation. It is a chilling and deeply ironic fact of history that Allen Dulles, the very CIA director whom Kennedy had fired in disgrace, was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to serve as a key and influential member of the Warren Commission, the very body tasked with investigating the assassination. For critics, this was the ultimate and most blatant case of the fox guarding the henhouse. The military leadership at the time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, shared much of the CIA's animosity towards Kennedy. As we have seen in other declassified documents from the era, such as the infamous Operation Northwoods Plan, they viewed him as weak, indecisive, and a man who refused to unleash America's military might against Cuba and communism. The idea that elements of military intelligence could have been involved in a plot, providing logistical support or security stand-downs, is a key component of many deep state conspiracy theories. The unholy trinity, a combined and plausible effort. For many of the most serious and respected researchers of the JFK assassination, the most plausible theory is not that it was one of these groups acting alone, but that it was a combined and compartmentalized effort, an unholy trinity of powerful interests, each with their own reasons for wanting Kennedy gone, and each playing a specific role in the plot. This theory suggests that the plot was likely orchestrated by a small group of rogue, hardline, anti-Castro elements within the CIA. They would have provided the planning, the operational expertise, the intelligence, and the crucial ability to manage the cover-up and manipulate the subsequent investigation. The Mafia would have been brought in as subcontractors, providing some of the freelance shooters, perhaps imported from Europe to avoid U.S. law enforcement scrutiny, and most importantly, the mechanism to silence the Patsy Lee Harvey Oswald, through their man in Dallas, the well-connected Jack Ruby. The anti-Castro Cuban exiles, fueled by their own fervent ideology of revenge and their desire to provoke an invasion of Cuba, would have provided additional gunmen and logistical support on the ground. In this scenario, Oswald was exactly what he famously claimed to be to the television cameras before he was murdered: a patsy, a pawn in a much larger game, a man with a complex and confusing history who was carefully positioned and manipulated to take the fall, his manufactured pro-Castro profile providing the perfect, albeit false, motive for the crime. Conclusion: the wound that will not heal. We have journeyed from the seemingly impossible physics of a single pristine bullet to a dark and disturbing rogues gallery of powerful suspects, each with a strong and compelling motive to see the young, charismatic president dead. We have seen how the official story, propped up by the Warren Commission and its logic-defying magic bullet theory, fails to satisfy the common-sense questions of millions of people, and continues to do so to this day. After nearly 60 years of investigation, both official and unofficial, the assassination of John F. Kennedy remains the great unsolved American mystery. It is a crime that has spawned 1,000 theories, 1,000,000 pages of analysis, and a permanent sense of distrust in the heart of the American public. The Warren Commission was tasked with a dual mission: to find the truth and to reassure a grieving nation. It arguably failed on both counts. It failed because its central conclusion seemed to defy the laws of physics, and because it ignored or deliberately papered over the vast and powerful forces that were arrayed against the 35th President of the United States. The death of John F. Kennedy was more than just the murder of a man. It was the death of an era, the loss of a particular kind of national innocence and optimism. It marked the moment when many Americans began to believe, for the first time, that their government was not only capable of lying to them on a massive scale, but was perhaps capable of the ultimate betrayal. The wound that was inflicted on the nation in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, has never fully healed, because the truth, in all its complexity and all its potential horror, has never been fully and officially told. And now, I want to turn this investigation over to you. What do you believe? Can you accept the magic bullet theory as a plausible explanation for the wounds suffered by President Kennedy and Governor Connally, or do you find it, as many do, to be a fundamental absurdity? If you believe there was a conspiracy, which of these groups, the Mafia, the Cubans, the CIA, do you find to be the most likely culprit? Or do you believe, as the government still officially maintains, that Lee Harvey Oswald truly did act alone? Let us know your thoughts, your theories, and your detailed analysis in the comments below. This is a conversation that is as important and as relevant today as it was in 1963. If you found this deep dive into the enduring and agonizing mystery of the JFK assassination to be compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. By hitting that notification bell, you'll join us for our next journey into the hidden histories and the dark secrets that continue to shape our world. Thank you for listening.